I have a new book out I wanted to let you know about. It's called ADHD and the Edison Gene. It's an updated version of a book that I published a few years ago called The Edison Gene that basically, you know, I started this whole thing out back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In fact, my first paper on this topic was published in 1980 or 81 in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry. And it was about testing the Feingold Diet with kids at the Hutter School at the Salem Children's Village, the program that Louise and I ran, to see if getting additives out of their diet dealt with their hyperactivity. And we had one kid that we could flip on and off like a light switch with a particular category of additives, the salicylate family. And all the rest of them didn't seem to be all that affected by the diet. And that was when I started, and I had spent some time with Ben Feingold. He had written in 1978, I think his book was published. I think he wrote it in 77, 76, a book called Why Your Child is Hyperactive, in which he suggested that hyperactivity came out of food additives. Now, Ben Feingold was a pediatric allergist. So all the kids he was seeing were kids who had allergies. And he noticed, and he talks about this in his book, if you go back and read his original book, he noticed that when he was able to figure out what the allergens were and get rid of the allergens and reduce the allergic response, particularly for children who had eczema, who had skin, problems as a consequence of their allergies, their food allergies, that their hyperactivity went away or diminished substantially. So he made the assumption that because his allergy kids, when they got rid of the allergens, their behavior settled down a little bit, that all the kids who were hyperactive must be allergic to something. Well, that's, is that a tautology or the opposite of a tautology? I don't remember my English language, but basically, logic has to flow in both directions. If you're going to say A equals B, then you have to also say B equals A, and it's not. So we tried it out. We tested it, and we didn't have the results that Ben Feingold predicted, except with one child. And I wrote that up, and I flew out to San Francisco, and I spent a day with Ben Feingold in his apartment in San Francisco overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, a beautiful the condo that he and his wife lived in there. He died the next year, I think, or maybe 2 years later. And in that conversation, and I'd shared with him our results, and he was like, I think maybe I've overestimated this. And at that point, I was really starting to think maybe this whole ADHD thing is not a disease. And maybe it's not an allergic reaction. Maybe it's a part of the spectrum of normal human behavior. And in fact, beyond that, maybe it's even a useful part of the spectrum of normal human behavior. And I came up with this theory that in a hunting-gathering society, which is what we all were, all of us humans, for 150,000 years, we were all hunter-gatherers. That in a hunting-gathering society, the three cardinal characteristics of attention deficit disorder, ADD, of distractibility, impulsivity, and a need for high levels of stimulation, those would be useful things. If you were distractible and you were walking through the forest during the day and looking for lunch, and you weren't constantly scanning around you all the time, you might miss that rabbit over there that's going to be your lunch, or you might miss that bear over there that wants to make you its lunch. So distractibility would be an asset for hunting-gathering people. Similarly, impulsivity. What's the dictionary definition of impulsivity? Behavior precedes cognition. We act before we think about what we're doing or saying. And so think about this. If you're chasing a rabbit through the forest, you're a hunter-gatherer, you got your spear in your hand or your bow and arrow, and you're chasing a rabbit, and a deer goes by. What do? The deer is more meat. However, the deer is going to be harder to kill. The deer is going to run faster than the rabbit. What do? Do you sit down with a pad and pen and say, let's do a risk-benefit analysis? Let me carefully consider this. No. You make an immediate decision to either stay with that rabbit or go after that deer. And you do it before you've even thought about it. I mean, you're just moving ahead. So impulsivity, again, a skill set for a hunter. And then the need for high levels of stimulation or high levels of arousal in your life. This is the third principal characteristic. And then if you add the inability to sit still for long periods of time, you have ADHD as opposed to just ADD, the hyperactive part. But anyhow, this need for high levels of stimulation. Who's going to be the most successful hunter? The guy who wakes up in the morning and says, hey, It's a beautiful day. I'm going to go out there in that forest or that jungle where there's things that want to eat me as much as I want to eat them, and I'm going to get lunch, and it's going to be fun. Or the guy who wakes up in the morning and says, there's things out there that want to eat me. I think I'll just sit here in the cave all day. Who's going to survive? So I suggested that ADD was a behavior, an adaptive, positive, behavioral set of characteristics that were genetically passed along, that are common to all humans, that were useful in a hunting-gathering society. But when we started the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and it wasn't all of us, keep in mind. I mean, this seems to have begun both in Central Africa, Central East Africa, and in the Middle East around the same time. And then it spread to other parts of Africa. In fact, the Bantu-speaking people of Africa, who were the first serious farmers, seem to have spread across most of the continent and subsumed many other people, many other peoples, many of the, drove the hunter-gatherers out of business, shall we say. And the same thing in the Middle East, and the same thing as they went up into Europe. In fact, the Norwegians, who were hunter-gatherers up until 900 years ago, were finally conquered by the Catholic Church 900 years ago, and that's when they started eating grains, which is why there's so much celiac disease up in Norway, because they haven't been eating grains for 5,000 or 10,000 years like the Italians have, for example. 1 in 5,000 Italians, or maybe it's 1 in 1,000, has celiac. 1 out of 3 Norwegians does. So, if you could see this evolutionary occurrence that is a clear result of the agricultural revolution in our gut, why not in our brain? So again, what would make a good farmer? Well, a good farmer shouldn't be easily distracted. You got to go out in the field and pick bugs off plants today, all day. Pick a bug off a plant, another bug off a plant, another plant, another bug off another plant, another bug off another plant, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, just picking bugs off plants. And as before they're growing, you're just sitting there waiting for the crops to grow. And after they're harvested, you're what are you doing? Canning, pickling, making bread? I don't know, but it's not exciting stuff. In fact, you don't leave the farm. So somebody who's easily distracted would be miserable as a farmer, but somebody who focuses really, really well and enjoys repetitive tasks would make a great farmer. So that's distractibility. Impulsivity, again, you can't have a farmer be impulsive. They got to say, the last couple of years we've grown wheat and it's worked out really well. But this year, let's try something new. I'm impulsive. I want to try pigweed. Doesn't work out so well, right? But you don't know until after the growing season. Hey, we didn't get enough grain from that pigweed or enough grass or green from it to survive. And so people would die. You can't have impulsivity in a farming society. And the need for high levels of stimulation, instead you need a high threshold, a high boredom threshold if you're a farmer, picking all those bugs off those plants. So I suggested that the people who end up as bookkeepers and CPAs who love that work are heirs to the farmer gene, as it were, and people who are salespeople and private detectives and police officers and astronauts and pilots, they tend to, who love stimulation and crisis and stuff, they tend to be descendants of the hunter-gatherers. So anyhow, I first proposed that in 1980. My first book on it was in the early 90s, I think 92. And I said, if we ever do the genetics on this, we're going to find that I'm right. And the genetics were done. A fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Moises out of the University of California. He did it, along with Yale University and the University of Beijing and UC Davis. And that's my interview with Moises and everything is all in this book, ADHD and the Edison Gene, a drug-free approach to managing the unique qualities of your child. So just an FYI, I'm not, trying to hype my book. It's not about selling the books. They're free in libraries, but I think it's just out, and I just wanted you to know.